Good morning, everyone. Welcome to 1 Million Cups Fayetteville. It is a pleasure to have each one of you. Glad you could come out and support small business. Today, we have a fantastic speaker. We have James Bacon from Edficiency that is going to come and tell us a little bit about his business. So I hope you've had an opportunity to grab yourself a cup of coffee, sit back and enjoy. Without further ado, James, I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all yours.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you very much, Lori. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here today. And thank you for everyone for taking some time out of your morning to join us. Hopefully you did get that cup of coffee already that Lori said and are somewhere comfortable. I'll go ahead and share my screen here and start. Oh, why is that doing that? Of course, let's try that again. There we go. Everyone can see my everyone can see my screen now? Okay, perfect. So my name is James with Edficiency. I thought, just based on presenting with other places before, sometimes people think sharing what I'm looking for today up front could be helpful. So I thought I'd do that, knowing that, we're an education company and likely a lot of you might not have direct education professional experience. I thought I'd try to give a couple different ways that, getting your input or feedback could be helpful. So generally, if you just think, and you have any feedback around the clarity of the language I use or the presentation today, that's always helpful. Always love that feedback. From a business perspective, if you have any thoughts on building partnerships with other people in the education space or scaling communication structures, like newsletters or stuff like that with current customers or, future prospects, that's something I always am thinking about. And then, lastly, if you're ever, have any friends in the education space that you would be interested in connecting me to, I'd always be happy to talk with others in the education space as well. So in case that's helpful. On the front end, I'll put the slide up again at the end when I open it up for just questions or any thoughts from the group as well. But thought I'd start there. So next, just a little bit about myself and my own personal background. So I taught, well, as I was sharing with Lori, actually, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I went to Wake Forest for undergrad, where I was a business major, and then ended up joining Teach for America my senior year as a campus recruiter, and then joined Teach for America and taught in a small town in Arkansas. I stayed with Teach for America and supported teachers across several different schools, including Charlotte and some others in Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana area. I do also have a graduate certificate in nonprofit management from Duke, but I've kind of spent my career, after teaching, doing teacher coaching, starting a region of Teach for America in rural Louisiana. I traveled abroad with my wife and did some work consulting for Teach for Bangladesh. We did some school and home rubble clearing and rebuilding in Nepal after the earthquake there several years ago. And then I've also served overseeing hiring at Boston Public Schools, which is a pretty large district. I also currently am based in Wisconsin, in Appleton specifically, where I currently serve on the Appleton Area School Board, the 6th largest district in the state of Wisconsin. And I'm currently running for election this spring with a primary coming up on Tuesday. So interesting times. But now, a little bit more about Edficiency. So in education, if you know any teachers or administrators, I'd imagine that, if you talk to them about what some of the biggest challenges they face are, at the end of the day, a lot of them will come back and tell you that one of the biggest challenges is that they just never have enough time with their kids, no matter what, but, yet still we know that kids need different things, but we still put them in the same classes with the same teachers, grouped with the same other kids, for the same number of minutes at the same time of day, almost every single day, despite knowing that and not ever feeling like there's enough time for teachers to spend with all their kids. And so to combat this big problem, a lot of schools have done what they call building in flex time, or sometimes it's called intervention blocks, or it goes by many names. But the basic concept is that, we have the whole school technically, unassigned at a given time. So there's not the same teacher they go to every day, or at least in theory, that's normally the plan. So they can actually go and get more time with teachers on a needed basis. So teachers can say they need to spend more time with a kid, or a kid could say they need to spend more time with a teacher, and then they can do that. But as you'd imagine, that starts to then create a whole other slew of logistical challenges that are also often time consuming, and not knowing where your kids are, especially at middle and high school level, but not knowing where they are during that time, which is, a big liability and something that not many administrators would be very excited about. And then you also run into just other issues around, like, how do teachers know how many kids they're going to get or who they're going to get, and all of that process to prepare accordingly. And so that is where Edficiency began. So this is my partner, Joe. He was a physics and chemistry teacher at the school, at his high school in New London, Wisconsin, when his school was trying to go through a process to better support kids and get them more time with teachers that they need. They kind of tried this one way with an advisory period that just really wasn't working out too well. And at the end of the year, he basically had said, I think I can come up with a better way to do this, and kind of committed himself to learning how to code over the summer and putting something together to try to solve this problem for his school, leveraging his database background from his time in the military. And so that is kind of then the next fall where the beta version, the original version of Edficiency began. And then it started spreading mostly throughout Wisconsin area. Neighboring schools would hear about it through people they knew and say, well, that sounds like something we also could use. And so he and I were talking the whole time, and once it started to spread a little bit more, we decided that we should actually turn this into something bigger. And so I've been on board for the last several years. But big picture, Edficiency is an online scheduling tool that automates and simplifies flexible logistics and scheduling for middle and high schools, really with the goal that teachers can get more time with students that they need, and admin can know what's going on in their building, where everyone is, and hold everyone accountable, both staff and students, for using the time well. And so the way the system works, sessions can get created by teachers for themselves for anything they want to do. So like I said before, academic support is one of the most common and the first thing schools really use this time for. But they pretty quickly realize they can use it for a lot of things, like making up assignments and tests, or providing enrichment that students wouldn't really have time to engage in otherwise, extracurriculars. So it really doesn't matter. They have a lot of settings so they can kind of control who is eligible to come to those sessions they make. They can request groups of kids, or they can request individual kids over any date range, depending on what the needs are. Students can also request to go see teachers whenever they'd like to. And there's 8 priority levels that they request each other at. And that's what our system will take at midnight the night before to decide where's the most important place to put each and every student until every single student is accounted for. It then emails kids that morning telling them where to go before they wake up. And then teachers log in and see their full roster of kids right there on their home screen and can take attendance, so that the administration knows every single kid in the building instantly that is showing up where they're supposed to or not. And so normally schools use things like Google spreadsheets or paper passes and all sorts of other things that are just cumbersome to do this. And so some of the things that make us different from that, or any of the other options out there, is that we automate the process to make sure every kid's accounted for no matter what, which is, I think, one of the biggest selling points to schools. So every single kid is accounted for at all times. We also assign kids intelligently with those 8 priority levels, so we know how to make sure that kids are where they're most needed, while giving teachers flexibility and not making them spend a lot of time trying to, fight over who gets to see who at what time. It also balances class sizes for teachers, never goes over the max class size for a specific session, and a lot of other things like that. And then lastly, it's flexible, so kids can request up until midnight the night before. So if they're struggling on homework tonight, they could try to get help tomorrow. And not have to waste class time to do so. Teachers could teach a lesson today. I was a math teacher, and so maybe I taught 4 of the same lessons, to different groups of kids. And in each class, I had about 5 or 3 kids that maybe needed some more help. I can pull them tomorrow all at the same time, so I don't have to waste regular class time trying to catch kids up, so that they can keep moving on with our regularly scheduled lessons. So we care about being easy to use and saving teachers and administrators time as former teachers and admin, because we know that, like we said before, that's one of the most valuable things there is. But really so that teachers and admin can focus on what they do best, which is supporting students and hoping to increase opportunities and achievement. And so, like I said, also, we're in Wisconsin. That's where we're based, but we have schools kind of all over the country at this point, as you can see from this map, with potential schools coming on board from a lot of countries that are still actually white on here. And in North Carolina, we're starting to get some presence across, large parts of the state. So we're in Greater Charlotte, the Piedmont Triad, the Appalachians, the Triangle, and hopefully, with what we're seeing kind of continue there with schools kind of rethinking how to give kids, different access to teachers at times, maybe that aren't super traditional in the traditional schedule that we all know. So it seems like that's becoming a bigger trend there. So, I expect that we'll probably continue to find more schools that believe we could be a help to them in North Carolina in the coming years. And so, again, I thought I'd just throw my contact information up here, and in case it's helpful, give some prompts. But I'm really interested in any questions anyone has, or any feedback or comments or anything you think is worth sharing, even if it's not aligned to any of the 4 bullets that are on this slide. But with that, I think I've technically gone over the 6 minutes, but I think I was under the 10 to 12 minutes that Lori said I could have. So I will go ahead and stop there and just see where conversation takes us. So thank you all.
So James, you mentioned the Greater Charlotte, the RTP areas. Are schools using this? Is it the private schools, or are public schools, charter schools, or is it all schools?
Great question. So we technically have all kinds of schools using us, but I'd say traditional public schools are the most common, and that's also where my partner's background is too. So that's maybe, I don't know. There are also way more of them. So I don't know how much of it's maybe self-fulfilling prophecy versus, just how it goes. But we have, several charter schools, though, sometimes that are a part of a traditional district and sometimes that they're not. And then we also have a few private schools as well. And it does seem like the private school space is starting to become a little more popular. This kind of model might be becoming a little more popular in that space from what I gather as well.
You didn't mention anything about your revenues. What does it cost? What does your revenue streams look like?
Yeah, so we charge schools annually. So it's basically a software as a service subscription model. So once a year billing. Every school is going to pay a different amount based mostly on the number of students, since we know that's pretty much how schools are funded, but also how they use us, the frequencies with which they use us impacts the pricing a little bit, just because we think that's also an equitable way with which to, hopefully, really honestly save some money for some schools and make it more affordable. The average school of ours is around 1,000-ish students, maybe 1,100 students, and the average price per school is around $3,600 a year. If that gives you a decent, kind of size there. I think our lifetime revenue is around, I don't remember exactly, so I apologize, but it's somewhere around like $700,000, I think, at this point, maybe a little under, but maybe a little over. And our annual revenue this year, I think, was in the 300, somewhere in the 300, 350 range. I can't remember exactly where it is. And we're still bringing on schools mid-year, even though most come on at the beginning. So.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Since we know that funding in schools, especially public schools, is limited,
Yep.
and a lot of teachers do have to pay for things out of their own pocket for their supplies for the classroom.
Yep.
How do you take that in consideration, and how do you overcome that point with schools when you're trying to sell your product? What is it that you say, and how can you help me with this, or how can you overcome that objection?
Yeah, so if I'm being totally honest, we have priced ourselves where I think we're very fair, and we get told that we are a steal financially more than we get told that we are, maybe not something that they can afford. So if I'm being honest, it doesn't come up as much as you would think, but whenever price does come up, I mean, like one, so teachers don't ever like need to pay for us. Like it's always comes out of the school's budget, given, it's a school-wide solution that impacts everyone. An individual teacher couldn't really use our software without the rest of their building using it too. It just wouldn't really be helpful. So, I mean, at least from that perspective, there's never the idea that like, oh, a teacher is going to have to pay for this. Although we actually did one time have a school where they gave a teacher an extra period, like an extra planning period to basically do all the scheduling. And, in there, because they didn't know we existed at the time, so they were going to have her do it manually for the whole building. She found us and she chose to pay us out of her own pocket that year. And so then she just like could use that extra time to do other things for her work. And then after that, then she told the school, and then the school paid for us instead. But normally, if I'm being honest, also, I know schools don't always think about it this way, but the amount of time that it takes a person or a group of people in a building to do what our system can do for you in, and honestly in minutes, is significant. And so if you think about the amount of money you're paying that person for salary, even a teacher who I think is incredibly underpaid in almost all circumstances, the amount of money that you are paying that person based on their time and the salary you're giving them and taking them away from whatever else they should be doing is actually going to be way more significant by normally at least 3 or 4 times the cost that it would cost for a school to just pay for our services. And so that I think also is something that sometimes, helps put things into perspective, when the cost is something that, is part of that objection or conversation.
I liked your second argument better than the first, because cost is it. I mean, it is a fact of life that school systems do not have nearly as much money as they should have. We all know that.
Yep.
But I wouldn't take it in that, well, they don't have to pay out of their pocket for, that I wouldn't use that argument. I liked your second argument about saving me time. It doesn't take away from my other responsibilities that where I could be spending on teaching and things like. I think that is a much stronger argument that you made about the fact that it's not taking man hours away from something else they could be doing. So I would focus on that part of it, of what you can bring to me and allow my teachers then to be in the classroom teaching and spending time with learning instead of doing the other stuff. I like that much better.
Perfect. Thanks. And that's all I would share with schools for whatever it's worth. The other part was more just big picture. I don't like, the context, but yes, thank you for that feedback.
We have a couple of questions in the chat as well, James. We have a couple of people that want to know, what age do the children need to be to use your software?
Perfect. And also welcome. Thanks from a fellow Okie, John. I saw that now in the chat too. So we focus on middle and high schools because the scheduling challenges that, they face to provide interventions or enrichment and all that type of stuff is far different than elementary. We talk about potentially expanding into elementary, but given that normally in most elementary schools, teachers have a lot longer with students, they normally go to one teacher for multiple subjects. So those teachers almost inherently have a little bit more flexibility where they can pull time or, use their time over different subjects in a little bit more of a flexible way. And so we really kind of deal mostly with middle and high schools, or at least in contexts where students have to change at fixed times to go to see other teachers. And you can't kind of just say, well, I want to keep all my kids today longer than, the school says I can, because that then impacts, all those kids in all the other rooms. And you also have, another class coming to you that's being sent from elsewhere. And so it's normally, middle high school, but sometimes maybe upper elementary ages occasionally as well.
And Morgan would like to know, how are you notifying your students, and what happens if they don't have access to computers or phones to receive the information? Yeah,
that's a great question. So like I mentioned before, we send emails every morning to students with their assignments. And so that is, one of the main ways. So that's what most schools use, or at least leverage primarily. But any student can also log in from any device. So, as you probably would expect, most students are logging in from phones when they log into the system, and most adults, often use a computer. But any device for any user will work, and you can get all that information that you need there in terms of notifications as well. But the question around devices is an important one. It's less common, if I'm being honest, after the pandemic, since most schools went to a one-to-one model, or at least have access to something like that. So even if they don't allow phones and or tablets in buildings, they often have Chromebooks or something like that. Or if sometimes kids just don't have those devices. So every adult in the building can look up every single kid's assignment, no matter if you have them on your roster or not. And so any kid could ask any adult in the building where they're supposed to go. We do also have a couple features in the system. So one option that is the more common one is, a scrolling list of the whole building, like every kid in the building's assignment, that you put up on some common spaces, like some, screens in the library or cafeteria. So kids know just to go look there before they go to their flex time. And they can just kind of wait until they see their name scroll by with the teacher and room they're supposed to go to. We also have an option, so for schools that do have tablets that they want to use, in public spaces, they can set up little tablet stations where kids type in their ID number and they hold the screen. It pops up with their assignment like it would in the email that was sent to them, or if they logged in from their computer or whatever. And then when they let go of that tablet, it disappears. And then the next kid, doesn't see their stuff and then types in their number and does the same thing. So there's a couple different ways, that we get around that for the, in most cases, the smaller number of students who might not otherwise have access to, the technology to access it in the ways that most kids do. And it looks like Deborah has what type of training is necessary. Do you want me to answer that one next, Lori?
Please.
All right, I pulled up the comments now so I can actually see them when they come in. So great question. So we build into the system a 3-minute video that any kid or staff member could watch to learn everything from a student perspective they'd need to know. And then we have a series of videos that are about 1 to 3 minutes for the most part, that total a little under 30 minutes if you watched all of them back to back, that really walk every teacher through what they need to know, because we know that teachers can't learn a system, all at one go. And, they have a lot of things on their plate, and it's best to have access to on-demand learning so that whenever they have the time and ability to learn something, they can, and they can watch it at 3x speed if they feel good doing that, and they can watch it at half time speed and pause every 5 seconds if they want to. So we have that in the system, which is, I think, one of the things that most teachers rely on. It's pretty intuitive, so a lot of teachers don't really need to watch too much about the videos either, if I'm being honest, but still plenty do. And then we also provide a 90-minute admin training for all of our new schools, where we walk them through, all the things they want from a teacher and admin perspective, make sure they have everything, in place and know what to do from an admin perspective. Because if one administrator spends about 5 to 15 minutes in the system a week, it works for the whole next week, even if no teacher or student touches the system. But during that training, we also really work to consult with them around their strategy and what they're trying to accomplish with the time and, our software, so that we, give them a tailored experience that, make sure they have what they individually need. All schools are different. And even if there's plenty of common themes across, different schools, there's often nuance in there that matters. And so we go into detail there. And then we, are happy to support them in whatever way is necessary. And occasionally we get asked to lead the staff training for a school, but almost always schools after the admin training feel like they have everything they need to just move forward and train their staff in the ways that they think make sense for their buildings.
James, other than they're all in education, if you look back at your customer base that you have right now, what are some common factors they have?
That's a good question. So, principals are our primary, like target demographic. Like our pricing doesn't normally, unless you're going to bring it on for every school in the district, doesn't normally warrant a district level conversation. And then normally they have the ability to, make decisions for their own campus. They're the head of that decision-making body. So in most cases, they're, principals. And so, outside of the fact that, ties them together from their job, they almost always have a master's degree. They're almost always at least like mid to late career professionals, I'd say, so have normally a minimum of, 3 to 5 years is very much on the low end in most cases. So normally at least about 10 to 20 years of professional experience on average. They Also, I think just in general are not always, but pretty frequently people that are, forward thinking, kind of trying to, solve problems and think outside the box is like another, I think pretty common characteristic of our schools or of our customers, excuse me, being principals that we talk with directly most. Is that the kind of thing you're asking, I guess, just to clarify and make sure that I'm answering your question as you intended?
That's part of, but how would you characterize the schools that tend to use it?
Oh, okay, at the school level then, sure. So, I mean, honestly, this is where it really just depends. I mean, they're all middle and high schools. They almost always, like I mentioned, about 1,000 students is like the average, but we do have schools that are as small as about 100 and schools that are as big as 3,000 currently. And it looks a little different in those contexts for different reasons, but I mean, that's one thing. They all, have a flex schedule in some way, and are thinking about time differently and how they're offering kids different things, through academic support, thinking about things like personalizing learning or tailoring instruction. I mean, those are all common things. But if I'm being, and then like I said before, I guess as well, most of them are traditional public schools, in small to medium-sized districts in most cases, though again, we have random independent charters that don't have a district, and we have some in pretty large public schools too. So we do just get a range, and then even some private schools in the mix as well. So it honestly just kind of depends. I think the main criteria though are being that you serve middle and high school students and that you're bigger than about 100. Like I wouldn't normally do any active outreach to schools smaller than 100 because I don't think that frequently they would have the need to warrant a software to solve that problem, because the scale that they're dealing with, if they have this time, is, I mean, some of them still come to us and say that they want us and they find value in it, but I just think it's a harder sell in those cases.
I'm surprised that you mentioned that mostly public schools, because I could see a great use of this in some of the larger private schools. One of the points being, like Morgan said, about the technology, because you're more likely in a private school because of the fact that you got to be able to afford a private school. You're more likely to have less issues with technology or access to technology or internet or anything of that nature. And most of the larger private schools are very go-getter type things. They want the best for their students because they're trying to get into really good schools, universities when they get out, that kind of thing. I'm just thinking you've got a really great opportunity in some of the larger private schools.
Yeah, and so we think about that, like if it's a hard thing, because we, like I mentioned before, our background is in the public school system. And so, I mean, in fairness, like we just know that landscape and can speak to it probably differently. And the other thing that I think makes it a little bit interesting is, I'm sure that once you get into the private school network more and more, then you understand how it's connected and, that piece. But normally private schools are more independent, like they're their own private school, whereas districts, serve mini schools. And so it's not uncommon that we get into a district with a school or two, and then we don't need to do anything other than provide the great service we provide. And then it just like we get more and more schools coming on board over the years too. And so knowing that that's the case, and we haven't even close to tapped the market that exists in the public school sector, we just haven't done a lot of targeting from the private school sector. They often also, it's much easier. So the kind of research I do before I reach out to a school is like finding their bell schedule and like, understanding a little bit of how they're approaching things like this. And that is also a much harder thing in my experience thus far to understand and find at private schools. Like they don't normally publish the same kind of information because they serve, to your point, a different constituency and a different kind of family or student in some cases, that's not maybe what they care about or the information that they would feel the need to put on their website, which sometimes also just makes it a harder to navigate space. But I am, I do agree to your point that I think there is a lot of potential there. And so, I am kind of interested as we continue to work with more private schools, what can we learn about that network of schools and how do we then like access them better? Because also I guess, public schools, every state has a middle and high school principal conference and organization, and and that's tons of our exact demographic, and so going to those spaces is an easy way to access them. And I don't know it doesn't look the same. I don't know how to find those equivalent spaces in the private school space, but if any of you know about that space more and would love to share more information, I'd always be interested in knowing more about it. So, and then it looks like we got another question in the chat. So Morgan asked, how are we reaching out to new schools to get on board? So it's a great question. So I'll show you this. So, I've done quite a few different things over the years. So, as we mentioned before, and so prior years, just in case it's helpful, is kind of like up prior to the last school year, like this past current school year. We were getting a lot of referrals, and those are like across district, because the in-district spread is, like internal district referrals. Like we already work with a district, and now just more schools want to come on board with us. And that stayed relatively consistent, whereas the referrals went down. And part of my theory on that is that through COVID, there were less people moving between schools, which is sometimes how those referrals happen, less conferences happening. I think people are kind of like just hunkering down, in their own buildings and or districts and just doing what they had to do, less networking. Word of mouth is kind of just more generally people hear about us, just stayed consistent. We didn't go to conferences through much of the pandemic because the virtual ones were not great when we tried one. But so I've done some cold outreach, so by prospecting and segmenting and kind of coming up with different theories and researching schools and reaching out to them so they know we exist, stuff like that. And that stayed relatively consistent at about a quarter of our business. But through the pandemic, what we've tried to do is think about leveraging social media differently. And so almost all, well, actually the only one in the prior years was from paid advertising. And then the current year, the past year, none of that was paid social media. So it was just really having more of a presence on social media and honestly finding groups where our target demographic hang out, and then posting resources that are helpful to questions they ask that get them to, have us on their radar. And then also just building those resources and then having people have a better chance of finding us online, through website resources and tools and information and just general SEO. And so that's kind of like how it's reached out. When I did the cold outreach, though, to the outreach part of your question, I did things like reach out to all the neighbors of schools that we already were in. So anyone, I reached out to all the schools in the districts that we already worked in to let them know that a school they knew was using us. I also reached out to any school that was in the same county as other schools that we used. So, like finding neighbors in that area. I also looked up all of our competitors and basically tried to find any schools that I knew use them, let them know that we exist, because this is a very fragmented space where language is often different between schools, and especially regionally. It's like looks very different from what people might even like call it or search for stuff like this, if they even think something like us might exist. I then also went to the 50 biggest metros, got a list of all their middle and high schools, bigger than 100 students, and then took random samples, looked them up to decide if it was likely that they had a flex time or not, to then decide what regions this is more popular in. I then emailed all of them to let them know we exist, offer to let them learn more, which is how I got a lot of those cold call outreach type things that you see on this chart. And then that also helped us to then say, well, here's different states where we maybe could go to conferences where this is popular, or here's where we want to then start emailing like all the schools in these metro areas that, this seems like it's a much more popular thing. Because, I think if I remember correctly, like Miami, only like 2% of schools we looked up offered flex time. And then in places like DC and Seattle, it was like 2/3 of schools, maybe even a little more in some cases, offered flex time. And so obviously I'd rather focus my time and energy reaching out to schools where I think there's a much more likelihood of, us solving an immediate need, not convincing them, to, implement a flex period schedule to then need our services. So does that answer your question, Morgan? And awesome. Thank you for the Horry County as well recommendation. If you know anyone there, I'd love a connection, and I can always also just reach out cold as well, though.
James, Danielle mentions that she knows a bit about private school meetings, so maybe we could provide her information or get you two together after the meeting.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. if you're interested, there's my email, or if you're interested in sharing yours, I can follow up with you, whatever you prefer, if you're interested in doing that, Danielle. Thank you.
Yeah, I can definitely email you. That's not a problem.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Deborah
You guys have a
also
great
has,
group.
Deborah has another question as well. How much time, how many man hours do you spend with each school, if any? I mean, for example, do
Yeah.
you go and set up the school system, or and give them like a demo?
Yeah, so on the front end, most schools sign up for, before they decide if they want to use us, they would, likely, not all, but most would schedule a demo. So normally we'd spend about an hour at least on the phone or over, showing them what our software does, answering their questions. Obviously some schools need a lot more than that to decide, and some schools will say, I've heard good things, I don't even need to see anything, we just want to use you. So that doesn't happen a ton, but it happens. In terms of the actual setup though, once schools decide to move forward, so we need very minimal information from schools. We just need names, emails, IDs of their staff and students, a list of their rooms and capacities for their rooms, and then just how those different things connect, like which kids and teachers know each other, which teachers use which rooms. And so they can choose to sync that information with their student information system, or just download some data from it and then give it to us and we'll upload it for them. So on the setup side, to get their site set up, it normally would take about 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours of someone's time, whether at the school or on the tech team, just kind of depending on the choices they make there. And then it would take someone at the building level about, maybe another hour to 3 hours at the most. It just depends on how nuanced and complicated, to be honest, like that school's specific vision and strategy for some of the decisions they're making is, because you can kind of have a lot of flexibility in our system and do a lot of different things if you want to. And so, but schools would kind of need to set that strategy up on the front end. So anywhere, from that time. So total setup time, is about, I'd say, normally at least about an hour and a half to about 5 hours from however many people are then going to give their time to that end of setting it up. And then plus a 90-minute training for whoever they want to include in that. Ongoing, if one person in the school spends about 5 to 15 minutes once a week, making sure that everything looks good for the next week, because our system doesn't know days that schools don't have classes or don't want to run a flex time, or they, want to change their strategy, that kind of stuff. But that's all the time that is needed really from there. So it's pretty low lift for the most part.
You said something that kind of triggered a question for me. You were talking about, your setup and what students have to be able to do to access and that kind of thing. Is your software, the what I interface with, only available in English, or can I, as a user, also access it in a different language like Spanish?
That's a great question. So we currently only offer it, from us in English. There's obviously some different, overlays that, can then translate the screen on a web page, like, Google, stuff like that, which I do believe some of our schools use in some cases. There's minimal text, though, to be honest, that you need to engage with in our site as well. So it isn't usually that challenging. Even for English language learners, and or there's those other accommodations. So we've worked with some different schools at different points, to accommodate those kinds of things or discuss how they would want to approach it. But that's a great question.
And since you are talking about student records, though, that you need access to, what type of cybersecurity protocols do you have in place to protect my student records?
Sure. So, again, the only information we take is your name, email, and ID. So it's minimal information. We actually actively don't want more information. We've never had a challenge with any security, knock on wood, but we don't want to have data we don't have any reason to have. That's not absolutely necessary, just in case there ever were. But we have our own dedicated servers. We also set up every single school site separately. So even if somehow a single instance or a single school's site, happened to be compromised, it does not impact any other schools, even in their own district on our servers. They would all have to be, accessed separately. So we segment all of the data in that way as well. in addition to, have encryptions and stuff like that. So my partner, to be honest, could probably speak way more in detail to all of that stuff than I can, if I'm being totally honest with you. But we do take it really, seriously. And we even actually often have schools that, say like, well, we'd love to, can't you just take all this information, like, and sort through what you need? And we say, no, we don't. We think that's a bad data practice. So we will not do that. We will absolutely only take what is necessary to do the functions that we need to do for you.
Does anybody have any questions for James?
Yeah, I'll take it, Lori. First of all, James,
Awesome.
go Deeks. Okay. And
All right.
there you go. I'm more interested in the business side of things because obviously from what you're looking for from us based on your slide presentation, you're looking to actually do more sales. And I got to tell you, I'm not hearing any of the issues with regarding how you're not getting sales. So I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you. First of all, what is your closing rate in terms of prospects?
That is a good question. And if I'm being totally honest with you, I need to rerun it. COVID really kind of upended that. Like where I stopped kind of doing the normal data roll up because it started becoming honestly just so not predictable, to be totally honest with you. And so I've been trying actually just now to say like, okay, we're getting back to where things are getting a little more normal. Let me go back and like start to house and like come up with those numbers again. But I would say that based on like last conservative estimates and some data of schools that had a demo with us, we closed about 40% on a conservative side.
That's pretty impressive. So I guess the next question is, outside of money, what is the biggest resistance you're feeling from these institutions?
It's a great question. Again, COVID has shifted that a little bit, to be honest with you. Because right now what we're facing in a lot of cases is like teachers are just so worn out and fatigued. So the idea of doing something new, like even if it's just a software that's going to help them save time, sometimes feels like a bigger lift, even if like decision makers are bought in. And so sometimes that, they say like, well, we'd love to bring you on now, but it's just not the right time. So let's wait and maybe go back, and the school sales cycle is long because most of them want beginning of the year timelines. But other than that being like the also reality, I think it is sometimes just resistance to change. It's normally that like we have our habits, we're just used to it. It sounds nice, but I don't know, or like I don't want to have to go through something new. Even outside of COVID is normally the biggest one.
Well, you kind of brought up where I was leading to here when we talk about decision makers. Is that generally who you approach, or do you seek out influencers as well? Because I'm thinking decision makers they're pretty occupied with a lot of different things, and much of this they rely on people to bring it to them, so you can educate somebody who is an influencer to actually lay this whole thing out to make it simpler in terms of transition and things like that.
Yeah, so that is kind of like what I'm thinking about more and more in the like number 2 on this list, just thinking about like those partnerships, like ways to, I guess I'd say like what you might think of in terms of like influencers being like, the influential people on social media and in the education or like to the principal world, or like the conferences, or existing companies that they work with and trust, and that could then be an influencer in those ways, in like more systemic ways. It's hard, I think, in some ways to figure out the right influencers at the local or like individual level for specific schools, because there's so many different constituents at play. And I have no idea which are the teachers that actually really are the influencers within that building versus the ones that aren't, unless I like really know the local landscape. And that's just really hard to do if it's not one that I know personally or have a connection to. But it is like, I think, back kind of also to this slide, a lot of times that referral or in-district spread happens because of kind of what you're talking about at more of the micro level. Like teachers hear about us from people that they value in another district or school that uses us, that then they kind of work their way up in their own school to influence the principal to move forward or to reach out or whatever. And so, more and more of our business is actually shifting to kind of the inbound side of things rather than the outbound side of things. But it's hard to figure out always what that right influencer, who those right influencers are at the micro level at least. But like we have a PTA actually bringing on a school potentially with us. I mean, so you just never know.
Well, in some cases, it's just a matter of getting information out to as many people as possible, and then somebody picks up on it. Somebody that's looking for a project is generally an influencer because I don't want to do this here, but I'm going to suggest that not all faculty are ready to tackle a new assignment. So that's not me, Cindy, but but the faculty generally doesn't seek out more work than they already have in many cases. But there are those who are very progressive thinking that might pick up on this if they have the information available to them. But if you're just going to conferences and approaching decision makers, that information doesn't get to them or get them excited. So it's just one way of thinking, and I think it's a very simple process to increase your mailing list somehow. I mean, it's not hard to track us down. So
no, that's fair. And I've thought about doing a little bit more testing with the theory, and to your point that like assistant principals could maybe be the right level of influencer, because honestly, in most schools, those would be the people charged with doing the work that we're talking about that then we can alleviate for them. It's sometimes teachers and occasionally principals, but normally it's not the actual principal. And so, but I've just capacity wise, I haven't been able to test it at scale enough. Like the smaller testing I've done hasn't really shown that it was any better. It actually showed it was a little worse, but I don't know that I have enough data, to be honest, to concretely, say that that's true for certain. And fortunately, they do show up at the conferences for whatever it's worth too, which is nice. So that's always kind of another, easy in as well from the influencer perspective too.
So at these conferences, do you do tabletops for these conferences, or do you actually get a speaking opportunity?
I mean, it depends a little bit on the actual conference, but almost always at least a tabletop. And then, excuse me. And then sometimes, we try to find the right ways to sponsor or present or something like that as well.
Okay, last question, because I'm hogging you here, but all these things are going through my head.
No, it's fun.
We're hearing a lot of positive stuff from you, so you get your sales cap on today. So I'm kind of looking for negatives here, and I've gone through your website and things. And one of the things that you offer are groups or actually whole classes where teachers can bring in students from the whole class. Do you get any feedback in terms of, Jesus, this particular faculty member is kind of dominating the students or anything like that? Or do you have other issues that I can't pick up here?
Yeah, so to be honest, our system kind of works where it solves the problem you just mentioned. So like you can't have teachers really hog students. It's hard for them to do so unless an admin basically kind of approves it and systemizes it for them. We get some complaints from individual teachers that don't like that like want to hog a kid, and they can't because our software kind of makes that hard for them to do, and the admin doesn't want them to. So that's a thing. I think we get occasionally sometimes some feedback around things that users think would save them time, but we are unwilling to do based on our philosophy because we think that it will have downward negative implications, even if it saves you a couple seconds here and there on the front end. So like we let admin create sessions, every teacher can create any individual session over any time, but you can't just as a teacher kind of like set up your own recurring session, so you have to go in every day and put your own session in if you want something that the admin isn't going to just push in for you. So you kind of have to, as a teacher, either get your admin to say like, yes, we'll approve you to do something, or you have to go in every day yourself and do it, which is like the work for you. So some teachers don't like that. But we also, believe that if you're doing something with that regularity, you probably should get local building approval. So like our philosophy is that at the admin level, they should be aware of it and then approve it and then make it for you. And we also think though that if every teacher kind of went on autopilot, if you will, they kind of said, sure, I'll do this all the time. They just put it all in. You start to run into bigger system or building wide challenges that might not be good for kids or the building at scale when all teachers don't have that global view. And so that's why we also funnel things up for stuff like that through the admin. And just to be honest, some teachers just don't like that. And I don't necessarily see, like we get it and we are all about saving time. That is one of our things we care about the most, but not at the expense of making sure that the purpose and vision and strategy is still actually achievable, and not without causing, in our opinion, what would be bigger problems. So I'd say like stuff like that certainly comes up, like especially from teachers who normally don't have a global sense of our program anyway. They have their own, perspective they're coming from. Normally otherwise though, like we're able to accommodate most feature requests from schools and stuff like that. So I mean, sure, we always find out there's things that schools think we could do for them that we don't yet. And, sometimes we can't do it all or not as fast as maybe they want it, but normally we actually can kind of accommodate most things or share with them why maybe that would be a bad idea. And then they realize and say, thanks for letting us know. But honestly, otherwise, like there's not, I'm trying to think what your original question was, but nothing else comes to mind, unless you wanted to go into more details or examples of anything kind of like I've already shared, I guess.
Hey, I got a question for you, James.
Sure, go ahead.
And before I asked it, best of luck on your primary next week. I've been there and done that. I know how that is.
Oh,
My
thank you for
question
doing
is,
what you've done.
yeah. Have you reached out to any elected school boards?
That is a great question. And the answer is no. I have not. I mean, I can say why if you want me to tell you why, but
Why?
So partly because, so really several reasons. One, because I believe that they normally are not in the weeds enough, I think, to understand the problem. And I'd rather, it depends certainly. But like often I think that might be the case. And maybe even for this. So I've reached out to a lot of different district roles because I think that they often are, in roles that are a little closer to schools. They're supposed to be supporting schools, and I've reached out to different kinds, whether it be curriculum or more of like a school management role or a school or like technology role. And it honestly almost, again, maybe I could widen my sample and have better data, but I have just not ever found like there's success as a cold outreach to that level. Okay. I think because, to be honest, like often they're not quite acutely, they don't feel the pain that schools feel when they do it the other way, unless schools are actively telling them. And that just doesn't always happen. And I think that sometimes too, there's a little bit of just the bureaucracy that is involved, to be honest with you, and the idea of like what really should come top down versus bottom up. And like I said, our software isn't priced high enough where it normally warrants like needing lots of above approvals. And so just in general, it seems like from what I've tested so far that going higher than the principal is often not the best use of time because it just doesn't end up translating in most cases. I'm still always open to testing it, but it's just kind of been my experience. Sometimes school board members are also harder to find their emails for too, just to be honest about that side of it.
Well, yeah, that's true. Okay, good answer. No, really, James, good answer. Because I think going back to Ken, I think, those assistant principals is probably your target audience is right there because they can push it up from that level. Mm-hmm. And they're on the ground. And what I mean by on the ground, they're in the classroom. Yeah. And that's what they do every day. They either monitor the halls or they're in the classroom in one way. So I think that's definitely where your target market is.
Yeah, thanks. And but I will say, just to clarify, like any warm leads at those levels, I do think can be still helpful, when you have a reason to then connect in a more nuanced way with someone. But I think it is just harder to when they don't have a reason to actually like think more deeply about any outreach, it's harder, at those levels too.
Well, it's all going to go up to the admin building for consideration approval by the superintendent.
Right.
And so that's where it's going to, that's where it'll be discussed before it even goes up to the school board.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, James.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Well, James, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to take the last question.
All right.
What can this community do for you? How can we help you?
Sure. So, I mean, I think other than, what you've already done today, which is just really helpful, because the more I hear just different perspectives and everything is always helpful, and different feedback and questions. But I think otherwise, if you have anyone in the education space in your life, teachers, people in districts, school leaders, school board members, like we mentioned, just telling them we exist is super helpful. Because like I mentioned before, it's a very fragmented space. And so, just to illustrate that point, flex time or flex periods are the most commonly used terminology to describe the time that our software, schedules for schools. And that is only about 10% of schools from my research of over 8,000 schools. So, the most common terminology to use is only 10%, which just makes it hard for people to know how to find stuff like us, or even that stuff like us exists to help them. And so just spreading the word is probably the biggest thing, but otherwise, if you want to connect individually about anything we've shared, I am always more than happy to do so. And I can put my email back up here. So if you want to reach out, my email is jbacon@edficiency.com. My number's there too, if you'd rather call or text, which is also fine. Always happy to talk about it, continue getting input from any of you and your experience about anything we do.
Well, James, we really appreciate it. Thanks for the fantastic presentation. Does anybody have anything that they would like to share that's going on in the community this week before we go? Well, if not, I hope everyone joins us next week. We have a great presenter. She's going to come and talk about eyelashes desire. I hope you guys come back. Y'all have a great week. James, again, thank you. I'll be in touch. Y'all have a great week. See you next time.
Sounds great. Thanks all. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.